Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to look at last year's Call of Duty World War II and see how it stacks up visually to the open beta version of the upcoming Battlefield 5. Now, before we proceed, both games are obviously significantly different, with Call of Duty being more of a fast-paced arcade shooter game, and Battlefield focused more heavily on large-scale multiplayer warfare. But they still offered enough similar elements thanks to the World War II setting that we can get some nice side-by-sides to compare things like texture quality, lighting, gun models, special effects, and sound design. Just to clarify, both Call of Duty and Battlefield are set to their highest available graphical settings on the PC platform at a 1440p resolution. And it's important to keep in mind that Battlefield 5 is still in its beta state, and I'll make a follow-up video when the game officially releases in November in case anything ends up changing visually. Alright, so to start off, we're going to take a look at some basic texture work between both games. Now, for the most part, Battlefield 5 has the upper hand in this department, with much sharper and more advanced texture designs. But I was surprised to find that the sandbag walls in Battlefield 5 weren't up to snuff with what's featured in Call of Duty. Now, keep in mind, the sandbags in Battlefield are somewhat dynamic, in that they can be destroyed and rebuilt, whereas the props in Call of Duty are completely static and cannot be interacted with. Still, it's surprising nonetheless. I also noticed that the vegetation in Call of Duty, at least in this particular instance, looked a little bit better. But again, same idea, the vegetation in Battlefield can be blown up if you wanted to, and so this and several other objects that populate the maps in Battlefield seem to not feature the same level of quality as the static props in Call of Duty. Other than those few examples, the rest of the textures look vastly superior in Battlefield. Next, let's look at some weapon models and firing animations. Starting off, we have the German STG-44 automatic rifle. This was actually pretty interesting. Call of Duty managed to sport some excellent detail in its weapon designs, on par with what's shown here in Battlefield 5. Sure, the lighting is far more advanced in Battlefield, and I'll talk about that here in a bit, but take a look at these small details along the side of the weapon. These pieces seem to have more depth than how they appear in Battlefield 5. Now, I'm no weapon expert, so if anybody knows why that appears this way in Battlefield 5, please feel free to let me know in the comment section. The weapon also looks a lot more worn down in Call of Duty, whereas it looks mostly pristine in Battlefield. Personally, I prefer the look of the weapon in Battlefield 5, mainly because of those great reflective surfaces alongside the gun. But you have to give Sledgehammer credit for the level of detail they were able to cram into this weapon model with such a limited graphics engine. Let's take a look at the weapon when it's firing. At first glance, Battlefield's weapons look much nicer, with that muzzle flash color being nicely reflected alongside the gun, and the sprite itself featuring more detail and complexity. But if you look closely, you'll notice Call of Duty managed to get something else right. The shadow cast by the soldier's hand here is shown accurately, blocking light from being cast on the side of the gun. This isn't the case with Battlefield, where there's no shadow cast by the soldier's hand at all. I've never noticed this before, and I'm curious if this will end up being the case with the final build of Battlefield 5. Another interesting find here is that the soldier's sleeve actually looks more detailed in Call of Duty than it does in Battlefield, with higher resolution textures and stitching, whereas Battlefield's textures look a bit stretched and out of place. Now let's look at the firing animation in its entirety. For the most part, both games get the firing animation and the reloading animation correct. But the main difference I want to point out here is that Battlefield seems to have more horizontal weapon sway when firing from the hip, whereas the STG in Call of Duty doesn't move in any direction. This is more of a design choice, as Call of Duty is designed to be more of a fast-paced arcade game, whereas Battlefield aims for a little bit more realism. The reloading animations are also a bit longer in Battlefield, with the soldier smacking the magazine after inserting it before pulling back on the operating bolt handle. The M1A1 carbine is a bit different between versions, with Battlefield featuring the folding metal stock and a different wood finish. The model itself looks much nicer in Battlefield, but I once again found a flaw with Battlefield's design. This is an insanely small detail that pretty much nobody would ever notice, but take a close look here at the bullet casing leaving the weapon after firing. The casing leaves the weapon before the bolt retracts, meaning the actual timing of this animation is slightly off in Battlefield. But Call of Duty managed to do this correctly, with the casing ejecting as soon as there's an opening. The MP40 again looks much cleaner and newer in Battlefield 5, though I don't think I've ever seen a version of this weapon with that style of wood housing, and most MP40s generally look like the one shown in Call of Duty World War II. Again, exact same issue here with the bullet casings. The casings appear too early in Battlefield, and it's out of sync with the firing animation. But the muzzle flash and reflective surface on the gun metal in Battlefield 5 is still superior. The FG-42 looks practically identical between versions, again ignoring the obvious difference in lighting and coloration here. All the details seem to match up perfectly, with minor exceptions being the small leather strap on the stock in Call of Duty, and the much more subtle etchings in the weapon sight in Battlefield 5. There's a few other very minor differences between the two, but the biggest difference by far is the firing rate. Up to this point, all of the weapons between these two games seem to fire at the same rate, but the FG-42 in Call of Duty fires incredibly slow and feels completely wrong. Next we have another LMG, the Bren. Battlefield 5 appears to have a side-mounted grip, which is a nice touch, but everything else seems to be accurate between both games, and once again, Battlefield 5's weapons look like they came straight out of the factory, whereas Call of Duty's look worn down, which is consistent with its overall texture design. And just like the FG-42, the Bren fires much slower in Call of Duty than it does in Battlefield 5. I've looked up videos of what this real-life weapon fires like, and it seems to match up with the rate of fire on display in Battlefield. And finally, we have the Lee Enfield Sniper Rifle. These two weapons again look identical down to every little tiny detail, with Battlefield sporting a brighter wood design. The weapon scopes also appear very different from each other. When zoomed in, the scope in Battlefield takes up the entire screen, with the crosshairs stretching from one side to the other. But in Call of Duty, you can still see the rim of the scope and a bit of blurred peripheral vision to either side, which is a nice touch. Now, here's one of the strangest differences. When firing these weapons, the muzzle flash for Call of Duty is insane, taking up most of the image. The muzzle flash in Battlefield is minimal and far more realistic, and the weapon itself kicks back quite a bit more. There's also a ton of smoke around the weapon in Call of Duty after firing, and a much smaller amount of smoke exiting the barrel in Battlefield. Alright, moving on, let's compare each game's lighting design. Now, this is where Battlefield really stands out. The lighting in Battlefield is far more impressive than the static, dull lighting direction in Call of Duty World War II. The world feels more alive in Battlefield, with the sun reflecting off of surfaces realistically and the environmental color popping more. Call of Duty just looks like a sea of mud and dirt. It still works fine considering the setting is supposed to look dark and desolate, but the lack of color variety generally hurts the overall image depth and makes everything look static and lifeless. It's also important to note that the time of day and sky color are pretty close to identical here, so it's really just the lighting design that's having this effect, not the setting. Moving on from lighting, let's take a look at shadow quality. Now, I was going to compare the shadow cast by the player in both games, but it looks like Call of Duty still hasn't managed to implement this very basic feature, and we're still unable to view our own character's shadows. So instead, I decided to use a nearby tree shadow and compare it to the one in Battlefield 5. And despite the shadow barely being visible in Call of Duty, at least it doesn't look like Battlefield 5's shadow. The shadows here are far too sharp, and the leaves from the tree all look like they're floating dots. This seems like something that will need to be fixed before the game's final release. Though again, just like the textures for dynamic props earlier, this makes sense. The tree casting the shadow can be destroyed by player interaction, so it's understandable that it wouldn't have the same realistic shadow casting that a static object in a Call of Duty map would have. And Call of Duty's shadows should absolutely be darker, but instead they are barely visible, and this was likely done to keep the environments brightly lit to benefit the competitive arcade gameplay. Now, let's look at special effects. First, let's take a look at basic grenade explosions. The grenades in Call of Duty will erupt into a massive fireball, with very little smoke or particle effects. The grenades in Battlefield, however, look far more realistic, with visible shrapnel streams and a larger emphasis on volumetric smoke effects over the fire. The screen also shakes in Battlefield, which adds to the immersion a bit more, though considering how much explosive spam there is in a Call of Duty game, I think the decision to leave out this feature was for the best. Now let's look at some fire effects. Once again, Battlefield's effects look much more impressive here, with thick black billowing smoke, ember particle effects, and better color quality, all reflecting nicely off the side of the weapon. But you had to give credit to the devs behind Call of Duty for some nice fire effect designs here, along with the nice reflective surfaces on the side of the gun. I also wanted to point out the destructive properties of the environment in Battlefield, where practically anything can be destroyed to some degree, like windows and even walls to structures. Call of Duty's environments are much more for decoration and don't react well to player interaction, with windows not even breaking after being fired at. Next we have smoke effects. Now this test I definitely want to run again when the game becomes available to play, because I noticed something really unique about the smoke effects in Call of Duty that I'm not sure function the same way in Battlefield. When the smoke grenade is thrown into this corner concealed by some shadows, you can actually see the light reacting realistically with the cloud of smoke. I'll have to try and throw a smoke grenade so that's in and out of shade simultaneously to see if this happens in Battlefield 5, but outside of that, the smoke grenades seem to look and function exactly the same way, though the way the smoke fills the environment in Battlefield looks a bit better. Alright, and finally I have a few sound comparisons. Which game do you guys think has the better sound design?
lost objective Able.
And that just about wraps up this direct comparison. Overall, Battlefield 5 has a much better visual presentation, but we did manage to find a few interesting effects that Call of Duty managed to execute better. These were very minor in the grand scheme of things, and it's difficult to say whether these are just effects not currently implemented in the current build of Battlefield 5, but we'll have to wait and see when the game officially releases this November. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.